So welcome everybody. So we can't see you, but we're glad you're there. And so to begin, as we gather today, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So the City of London and Western University are located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lunapiwak, and Attawandaron peoples. We acknowledge and pay respect to the land and to elders past, present, and future. Wherever you are joining us today, across Ontario or across Canada, we honor the long-standing work of relation building between Indigenous peoples and the places and landscapes in which we gather today. So I have the pleasure of introducing Seth Klein. And to just give you a sense of the evening, Seth will talk about his book and give us kind of a, I'll call it like a flash nonfiction version of it for about 15 or 20 minutes. After that, I'll interview him for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll open up the Zoom to questions. Okay, so Seth has served for 22 years as the founding British Columbia director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is an independent, nonpartisan research institute concerned with issues of social, economic, and environmental justice. Seth has a long and impressive record in policy development and activism, including serving for 8 years as co-chair of the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. He is a founder of the Metro Vancouver Living Wage for Families campaign. He is also a founder, advisor, and instructor for Next Up, a leadership program for young people committed to social and environmental justice. His activist commitments go as far back as a high school student and in being involved in the anti-nuclear movement. His book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, is published this year by ECW Press. And this book is kind of a made in Canada version of the Green New Deal. The book calls on Canada to lead at home and abroad on the immediate and rapid development of renewable energy infrastructure, while also drawing down rapidly in the next 10 years our greenhouse gas emissions. The book also argues we should lead in terms of a political and social vision, and even an artistic vision, which is welcome in this Words Fest, that addresses the economic inequality and also workers' rights along with job guarantees, and also leads in terms of decolonization and supporting Indigenous rights and treaties and title claims. So also tonight, I'm glad you're with us because it is also a special night. It is Remembrance Day, and a day to gather and honor the men and women who have fought to secure peace for Canada and the world. Seth's books argues that we should honor veterans and our nation's role in securing victories in the world wars of the 20th century by mobilizing ourselves in the 21st century to confront a situation that is, well, not exactly war, but very much about how to live peacefully and sustainably together on this planet. So please welcome Seth Klein.
Thank you, Joshua. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you. Thanks to all of you for your interest. Thanks to the Words Festival for this invitation. So I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as Vancouver. And I'm really very pleased to be with you on Remembrance Day in particular, an apt day given the focus of my book. So I've been asked to offer some opening comments about my book before we move into discussion. This is the book, by the way, given that it's a virtual event. I thought I would show it to you. I hope and believe that my book calls on us to adopt really an entirely new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one we have pursued to date. And its original twist, as Joshua was alluding to, is that, as the title suggests, the book is structured entirely around lessons from the Second World War. And I should say right off the top that there's no small irony in me coming to this place. And like many of you, I suspect, I too wrestle with the war analogy. My own political activism started as a teenager in the peace and disarmament movement of the 1980s. And moreover, I am actually the child of Vietnam War resistors. That is, in fact, how I happen to be Canadian. But I am now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society, galvanize our politics, and to fundamentally remake our economy. This book project began as an exploration of how we can align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we must urgently do to address the climate emergency, and the book is that. I had initially planned to include only a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War, because I had long been intrigued by World War II as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that work, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the entire book around lessons from Canada's World War II experience. Again, not because I get all weirdly animated about war, rather it is because I see in the history of our wartime experience this helpful and in fact hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across society to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we have retooled our entire economy, twice in fact, in the space of a few short years. I am an interloper in the field of history. And given that, actually, I want to thank a Western history professor in particular, Peter Neary, who I think is among those watching tonight, who was one of the historians who graciously agreed to review the draft manuscript and save me from historical embarrassments. So the book explores what wartime scale climate mobilization could actually mean and look like. And each chapter jumps back and forth in time between stories of what Canada did in the war and what we now face. And in these comparisons, it answers questions like, how was public opinion rallied to support mobilization during the war? How might it be galvanized again? How was social solidarity secured across class and race and gender and region? And can we do that again? How did we marshal all of our resources to produce what was needed? Can we do that again? How did we pay for that transformation? And can we mobilize the necessary finances once again? What supports were offered for returning soldiers? This is the area of Peter Neary's own research and expertise. And is there a model there for just transition for fossil fuel workers today? What was the role of Indigenous people in the war, and what is it in today's transformation? What was the role of youth in social movements then and now? But also importantly, what are the war's cautionary tales, the things that brought us shame, the internments, the squashing of civil rights, the poisoning of Indigenous lands, and perhaps most apt to the current crisis, the response to refugees, those things that we don't want to repeat. And really running through it all, what sort of political leadership do we require to see us through challenges like this? And I'll start with one important comparison I make near the beginning of the book, because it gives me some hope. And it is this, which is that despite Canada's war declaration in September of 1939, it's worth recalling that, even as the winds of war gathered in the late 1930s, our leaders were reluctant to recognize what would ultimately be necessary, a lot like today. Canada was on the cusp of being completely transformed by its Second World War experience, yet right up to the 11th hour, our government and most of the public still hoped to avoid getting dragged into that fight. And so we find ourselves in a similar awkward period today. The summer before last, the federal government passed a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day, and then proceeded with reapproving the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion the very next day. That's what I call the new climate denialism. It's a concept I unpack in the book. But as with the Second World War, I am convinced that this phony war period will not last, and indeed that it is about to end. It's my view that we need a new wartime scale approach for three reasons, really. First, because both the war and the climate crisis represent profound existential threats to our security and well-being and civilization. If we fail to rise to today's climate emergency challenge, the human, ecological, and economic costs will be devastating. The science is now absolutely clear, and I just take it as a given in my book, that if we do not act quickly, then over the course of the rest of this century, things start to get horrific. A world that is unlivable and catastrophic for many, deeply disruptive for all others, and quite possibly ungovernable. Second, I think we need a new approach because what we have been doing in response to the climate crisis thus far simply isn't working. If you look at Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back over the last 20 years, what you basically see is a flat line, meaning emissions are no longer climbing, but neither are they in decline. Despite decades of calls to action, our emissions are not on a path to stave off that horrific future for our children and future generations. We have run out the clock with distracting debates about incremental changes, but where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we have accomplished precious little. And nature doesn't care that our emissions are not climbing. You know, the great climate change warrior Bill McKibben has said, winning slowly on climate change is just another way of losing. And politics, as they say, might be all about compromise and the art of the possible, but there is no bargaining with the laws of nature, and nature is now telling us something fierce. But third, and this is a key message of my book, we need a new wartime approach, because when we adopt an emergency mindset, amazing accomplishments become possible. As we've all witnessed in recent months, something powerful happens when we approach a crisis by naming the emergency. It creates a new sense of shared purpose, a renewed unity across confederation. It liberates a level of political and economic action that seemed previously impossible. During the Second World War, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is simply mind-blowing. During those 6 years, with a population less than a third what it is today, Canada produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the fourth largest air force in the world at the time. Here in my province, you know, where we don't even seem to be able to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced about 350 ships just in this province, again, from a base of virtually nothing. So, you know, just a pause for a moment and reflect on the speed and scale of these accomplishments, because so often when talking with each other about climate, one hears the refrain, you know, but Canada is just a small country, and what would it matter if Canada were to act on climate, especially if the US is going the opposite direction as it was under Trump, which thankfully appears to be coming to an end. But, you know, putting aside for a moment that Canada's per capita GHG emissions are actually among the highest in the world, and we are the 6th largest oil producer and 4th largest gas producer in the world, but put that aside for a moment, because one of the things that inspires me about our World War II story is that we didn't wait on the Americans. We threw ourselves into that fight 2 years earlier than the US, and in fact, for most of that time, we were the only country in the Western Hemisphere engaged in the war, and we were an even smaller country then. And when it was all over, no one questioned the value and importance of our contributions. So given that this is Remembrance Day, I thought I would just share stories about 2 vets that are in my book. The first drives home what I see as a key lesson from World War II for the climate emergency, and it is that Indigenous leadership and title and rights are central to winning. One morning as I was writing last year, a news item came across the radio about the death of Louis Levi Oakes, the last of the Mohawk code talkers from the community of Akwesasne. So much like it had been important to Canada to independently declare war from Britain in 1939, interestingly, the Iroquois Confederacy, of which the Mohawk are members, also independently declared war on Germany, which resulted in many Mohawk men enlisting. Oakes died at the age of 94. The code talkers were Indigenous soldiers who were tasked with using their own languages to communicate secret military information among Allied forces. In the news reports after Oakes's death, his daughter revealed that, astonishingly, Oakes hadn't told his family what he did during the war for 7 decades. Having been sworn to secrecy, only in his late 80s, when stories of the code talkers were finally made more public, did he finally reveal what he had done, and then he got a Congressional Silver Medal and special honors from the Assembly of First Nations and the Canadian House of Commons. He was one of 17 code talkers from Akwesasne, but there were hundreds of other Indigenous nations of others from Indigenous nations across North America. As the war was unfolding, the secret codes employed by the Allies to communicate military plans kept getting broken by the Nazi and Japanese forces. The US Marines then discovered that enemy forces were unable to crack Navajo, and then they ultimately recruited Indigenous soldiers from 33 language groups, including a number from Indigenous nations in Canada like the Mohawk and Cree, Tlingit, Ojibwe. But as I learned of this, it struck me that there is in this piece of our wartime history a tragic irony. Our two countries have spent generations trying to erase indigenous languages from the earth. We literally beat them out of children in residential schools, only to then uncover that these languages were the unbreakable code. That's what they were dubbed in the war, credited as having been vital to victory in certain battles, particularly in the Pacific. And then if we fast forward to today, the same can be said about Indigenous rights and title, which similarly our two countries have spent generations systematically abusing and violating. And yet, as our mainstream politics dithers and dodges on meaningful and coherent climate action over and over and over again, it is the assertion of Indigenous title and rights that is buying us time, slowing and blocking new fossil fuel projects until our larger politics comes into compliance with what the science says we must do. My second story is about a man named C.G. Gifford. So, those who served overseas during the Second World War, of course, came back forever changed, but some of them drew lessons from their war experience that motivated them to fight for peace and human survival for the rest of their lives. They never stopped doing what they could to secure our collective future. And when I was a teenage peace activist in the 1980s, I had the great fortune of getting to meet some of those people, including Gifford, who was a lovely man and a co-founder and longtime chair of an organization called Veterans Against Nuclear Arms, or VANA. Gifford was raised in a pacifist household, but as he watched the rise of fascism as a young man in the 1930s, he became convinced that Hitler had to be stopped. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1941, became a navigator, flew 49 bombing raids, and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He and a handful of other vets founded VANA in Halifax in 1982, when the Cold War and nuclear arms race were still in full swing, and when then US President Ronald Reagan used to talk about fighting and winning a limited nuclear war. And alarmed by talk like that and fearing for our future, it wasn't long before VANA chapters had sprung up across Canada and grew to 800 members, most of them Second World War vets. And they would attend peace marches and Remembrance Day ceremonies wearing white berets to symbolize both their past in the military and their desire for peace. Gifford died in 1993. So those VANA vets are no longer with us as we now face down the climate emergency. But if they were, I've no doubt that they would be with us in this fight and marching with the student climate strikers. They really were the ones who led the way in terms of taking lessons from the Second World War to confront global crises in the present. In the first chapter of my book, just to give you a teaser, I share what I see as some of the key lessons from the war, which I dubbed the battle plan for climate mobilization. It's a 14-point plan outlining what it looks like to adopt an emergency mindset and do what it takes to win. I'm not going to run through them all now. I won't have time for discussion, but I will mention, as I've been doing book events, I'm often asked, how do you know when a government gets it, when it's in emergency mode? And I've pulled from those lessons what I see as 4 markers of when you know that a government has moved into emergency mode. And they are they spending what it takes to win? Are they creating new economic institutions to get the job done? Are they shifting from voluntary to mandatory measures as required? And are they telling the truth? Are they communicating and talking about this in a way that looks and sounds and feels like an emergency? All of those things happened in the Second World War. Interestingly, I would say the Trudeau government has practiced all 4 of those things with respect to the pandemic. And I would also say that they fail spectacularly on all 4 markers when it comes to the climate emergency. And maybe we can flesh out some of those 4 points in discussion. I'll just say this by way of a final thought, and then we'll open it up, which is this. Like many of you, as I read the latest scientific warnings, I'm afraid. In particular, I feel deep anxiety about the state of the world we're leaving our kids and those who will live throughout most of this century and beyond. All of us who take seriously these scientific realities wrestle with despair. That is the ambiguous time in which we live. The truth is we don't know if we're going to win this fight. if we're going to do what we need to do in time. But consider this. In the Second World War, from a population at the time of a little more than 11 million people, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. It's remarkable. But it's worth appreciating that those who rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago likewise didn't know if they would win. We often forget that there was a good chunk of the war's early years during which the outcome was far from certain. We know how that story ended. They did not. Yet that generation rallied regardless, and in the process, surprised themselves by what they were capable of achieving. And I think that that's the spirit we need today. And I'll stop there and let's talk about it, Joshua.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Seth, for that overview and connection to Remembrance Day. So this is great. I really actually wanted to start our conversation off, and just to remind everyone, I'll ask Seth a handful of questions here, and then I'll open up the floor to some Q&A from the audience. But so I wanted to start off the questions actually by asking a bit about craft, since we're here at a words festival and literary creative festival, and sort of take us into that experience of writing this book, a little bit sort of your writer's room, and tell us a little bit about how you actually, I'm curious about when you realized the structure of the book was going to be sort of comparing war mobilization to climate mobilization. So where did that come about in the process? Yeah, and how did you decide that would be the frame for what you call an emergency mindset?
Yeah, good question. So as I was saying, I didn't originally plan to write the whole thing about the Second World War. I was going to write about the climate emergency and about this gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And the original book outline that I had only had a single chapter on the Second World War. But as I say, I dug in and I kept seeing these parallels. At the same time, early on, and I should say, I had spent 20 years writing policy reports. They were good, but they were policy reports. I had never written a book before. And so I started off meeting with friends of mine who were, real writers and seeking their counsel. And almost all of them said, if you're going to write a book, you need story, you need narrative. Probably no surprise to you. And again, as I delved into that World War II stuff, I started to realize, hey, there's a lot of story here. This can give the book the narrative thread that I need to run through it. And that really happened a couple of months into the work. And I don't even think I appreciated, though, initially, but have really come to appreciate, particularly as I now talk about the book with different audiences, is that there was an additional advantage there. Well, first of all, it meant there's a lot of boring policy books out there on climate, and that only talk to your head, and so this frame was a vehicle that allowed me to talk to the head and the heart, and to allow myself to express some fear and frustration and impatience, and not just to talk policy. But additionally, what I came to appreciate is that so many of us have a personal connection to the World War II story. And I'm trying to use that. So whether or not you're a liberal or a New Democrat or a conservative, or an engineer or an architect, or a journalist, or a labor leader or a business leader, there's pieces of the World War II story and people there who are important to you and your sense of purpose and legacy. And I'm trying to tap into that, to say to those people, these people who were important to you, this is what they did when a moment of emergency happened. Now, who do you want to be today?
Okay, great. Yeah. Oh, and I'll just say that, like, if you're writing policy, or if you're writing, nonfiction, or if you're writing email, I always tell students or audiences that we have to write well. That's got to be, something that we put pride in and we focus on. And I'm pleased to say your book is well written. And I think
that means a lot coming from you.
Yeah, so I think audiences will find that too. It reads very briskly and full of information, but also full of bright ideas. So I wanted to ask you actually a little bit more on the literary side still. Tell me a little bit about some of your own literary interests and your influences and sort of connections that you made while writing this book. First of all, I'm thinking of the astonishing amount of literature and film and photography on World War II. But I'm also thinking of things like the tradition of utopian literature.
Mm-hmm.
But it's clear that your book is something different. It's not exactly in that tradition. It's a political plan forward. But again, I'm wondering still what sort of literary models you had in mind while you were working.
I don't know that I had a literary model in mind. It may be because I don't think of myself as like a professional writer in the same way. I've always loved reading history, both, actual history books as well as historic fiction. And as a young person, of course, there were historians like Howard Zinn who were a big influence on me, the guy who wrote A People's History of the United States, and another Howard Fast. I think I've read almost every book he ever that he wrote, who really worked in the genre of historic fiction. And I read a lot of Kurt Vonnegut as a kid, and there's bits of that come up in this book. But I'm probably more influenced by people who write as journalist storytellers about economics and politics. So, Linda McQuaig was a big influence on me. And of course, my younger sister, Naomi Klein, is an influence on me. And I read, I edited her books. Yeah, those are all parts of it.
Okay, great. Okay, let's talk about the main argument here, where you have you're using Canada's military history to think about how to mobilize in an emergency way. And I admire really the big thinking approach that you take in the book, and you emphasize that very clearly, that in fact the opposite, sort of the small thinking, is a kind of climate denialism, you call it even. Mm-hmm. So I am a supporter and not a skeptic, but there's always, but as you say, and every reader I think wonders, military is military the way to go here? Because for the obvious reason that, for example, the U.S. military, I believe, is the world's largest single sort of polluter entity, and war is obviously very ecologically destructive. So why not use models of peaceful mobilization? Mm-hmm. The New Deal is the obvious one, we know, but civil rights movements, Marshall Plan, why not use those as models instead?
Yeah, well, I do a little bit. Look, I'm wrestling with that too, and the fact that my roots are in the peace movement made this an unlikely place to land. First of all, just to mention off the top, it's that ambition that I'm trying to draw on, and really, in that World War II story, I'm trying to excavate this memory of what we are actually capable of doing at scale and speed when we have to. And in many ways, I think, this is the most insidious and destructive legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism. It's not the spending cuts and the tax cuts and the privatization and the deregulation. It's the sapping of our sense of ambition and possibility and our own belief in our ability to do grand things together. That's what I'm trying to excavate. And why am I framing it around the World War II story rather than the New Deal, which is this positive example, is because I've written a very Canadian book and we didn't have a New Deal the way the Americans did. For us, the war was our New Deal in terms of banishing unemployment and doing those big things. And that too is a source of hope, right? That here you had FDR in the States doing all these incredible things in the 1930s, and our own federal government just not able to go there, not able to get out of this narrow thinking. And if you had said to Canadians in 1938, does the Mackenzie King government have it in them to do something as audacious as what they ended up doing in the war? Most people probably would have said no. And yet they surprised us. But I also cite in the book that famous essay by the American philosopher William James, The Moral Equivalent of War, where his roots are as a pacifist, and he's recognizing the power of war to provide a sense of purpose and meaning and solidarity, and looking for, well, what is the peaceful substitute? And that's what I'm doing too. That's what the book is saying. It's saying, if you're looking for what that non-violent substitute is for the ambition and purpose of war, let me introduce you to the climate emergency.
Okay, that's great. So I wanted to actually read a sort of passage here on page 107 and have you respond here. So this is 107. Okay, you write. So inequality serves as a barrier to cross-society mobilization. To understand that effective mobilization isn't merely about building more planes and tanks, or today, wind turbines and solar panels. It requires policies that fulfill a promise that we will better look after one another, that we will offer good jobs and income supports to all, and that people will be treated with dignity and fairness. When you're asking people to share in a great undertaking, that's how you keep everyone on the bus. Mm-hmm. So I think it's nicely said. Although first thought though is just that a lot of people don't associate, let's say, climate emergency with, we call it an economic emergency. And there, I'll just think of out loud, like what you just said isn't on the table for most, someone like Elon Musk, who's not, mm-hmm. about this kind of mm-hmm. social change and economic change. So yeah. Why do you think they go together?
Well, so you're absolutely right that a lot of climate policy wonks, purists out there argue very vigorously, don't link climate with inequality and social justice stuff. Don't overcomplicate it. Climate change is challenging enough, right? Don't weigh it down with all of these other tasks. And I am respectfully saying that I think they're wrong. And that tackling the climate emergency is fundamentally linked to tackling inequality for a number of reasons. First of all, because they're linked. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are, either as an individual or a community or a country, the more vulnerable you are to the impacts of climate change. And so they have to be linked. But the main reason I'm arguing they should be linked is because that's how we win in this fight. And as you say in the quote, I'm arguing that one of the key lessons from the Second World War is that inequality is toxic to social solidarity and the kind of solidarity you need for a societal mobilization. In the First World War, well, actually, before I even mention that, I did some original polling for the book as well with Abacus data. And there too, you see what I'm getting at. I asked Canadians what their level of support was for what I would consider truly bold climate actions. And the good news is it's very high. But then I also asked them, well, would your support go up or down if we tackled those things and paid for them by increasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations, by increasing income transfers to lower income people, offering a good jobs guarantee to fossil fuel workers? The support for bold climate action, when you do that, doesn't go down. It goes through the roof. That's why you see the political appeal of something like the Green New Deal. Even when you ask Republicans about that linkage with inequality, you find very high support. But here's where it has its roots in the war. In the First World War, to go even further back, inequality undermined social solidarity. It actually undermined recruitment. There was rampant profiteering in the First World War. that undermine that social solidarity. So at the beginning of the Second World War, Mackenzie King was very cognizant of this. And his principal political objective was to get the enlistment numbers that he needed without having to resort to mandatory military conscription for overseas service. Now, you need social solidarity for that. And so what does he do? He increases taxes on the wealthy and corporations. The corporate tax rate not only went from 18 to 40%, but they brought in an excess profits tax, which meant that the kind of profiteering we've seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. On the flip side, Canada's first major social programs come in the war: unemployment insurance in 1940, the family allowance in 1944, the Marsh Report, this royal commission that really laid the architecture for the entire modern social welfare state, was written during the war and is offered up to Canadians as a promise and a pledge that the society they came back to would look different. Because if you're actually trying to achieve that level of mobilization that they ultimately achieved, you had to make those linkages and make that kind of a pledge.
Okay, I love that answer. I love the detail you have, about how Canadian society changed after World War II, and set the grounds for the welfare state. That those grounds are fading or being contested, on a constant basis even today. So actually, I have really, let's say, one last question, then I'll open up to the question and answer. And we have a lot of Q&A already. So here's my last question, which is a bit more philosophical. So I've heard Naomi Oreskes, the great scholar of climate denial movements, talk about, in her mind, really one of the things that was preventing major change was, she pointed to the idea that the concept of freedom is a real sticking point. So people associate freedom with, for example, very tangible things like driving wherever they want, or which is in reality polluting whenever they want or however they want. And so it also makes me think of, in your book, wars certainly are fought for freedom. So this term is very important, and people will fight for that. But I'm wondering, how do you think we go forward? How would we need to redefine freedom or figure out how to sort of mobilize freedom? If we can, where do we start in your approach?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I do think we need to figure out a way forward that is more participatory, first of all, that draws upon the most innovative kinds of democratic engagement that we can. I don't think we should be arguing about the targets that we need to set. Those should be determined by science. But how we actually achieve those targets, I think, is a conversation that we should welcome. And so I'm a big fan of citizen assemblies. And actually, both the UK government and the Irish government have started to use citizen assemblies to tackle the climate question. And in some ways, those citizen assemblies end up giving a bit of political cover to politicians who would otherwise not be courageous enough to do bold things. And many people in the public are prepared to go along. Basically, they trust their fellow citizens more than politicians. And so they're prepared to go along with the recommendations of a citizens assembly in a way they may not coming directly from politicians. In the end, though, I don't think we need unanimity for big changes like this. And there is a different kind of liberation that comes when we take collective action. So one of the problems I think we have faced on climate is that if you survey all of the federal and provincial climate policies to date, they're all voluntary. We incentivize change, we encourage change, we give rebates, we send price signals. It ain't gonna work, and it wouldn't have worked in the war. We need to actually move towards mandatory policies. So like here where I live in the city of Vancouver, as of next year, where they have a true climate emergency plan at the municipal level, as of next year, new buildings won't be able to use natural gas for heating, right? Clear dates. What comes with that is so much of the climate discussion in the last decades have individualized the solutions. And the public, I think, intuitively gets, like in a war, that this is a collective enterprise. But nobody wants to be a chump, right? People think, well, I wish, I know I should sort of do such and such, but if my neighbor isn't, does it really matter? And they're not wrong. And so when things are mandated, we all get the comfort of knowing, and again, we've all experienced this a bit in the pandemic, that everyone is in. And then social changes can actually happen with remarkable speed. Like I like to give the analogies of, I remember when mandatory seatbelt laws were coming in. And I remember when laws came in banning smoking in bars and restaurants. On both of those occasions, I remember the pushback, the restaurant industry saying it was going to be the death of them. And people reacted to seatbelt laws as this terrible infringement on their civil liberties. But there was enough of a vocal minority demanding things like that, that the politicians acted. And then with remarkable speed, those things become the new normal. And that's going to happen again. Our kids aren't going to know what a gas station is except what they see in old movies. Um, and that's going to happen over the next 10 years.
Okay, I love that time frame and optimism. So let's turn to some of the questions from the Q&A. So Michelle Bowman asks, which parallels from the COVID crisis can we use to help jumpstart climate action? I actually wanted to add to that question, maybe, when COVID hit, I think we all, we saw the change overnight, and we thought also maybe something very different could be possible, and we could have a very different kind of Canada or of a planet if we do this when we act together. But that said, we don't have a jobs guarantee out of COVID. And inequality is not, it's some people want to address that, but it's not front and center. So what are you, sort of re-ask the question. So what are the parallels for you?
It's a mixed bag. I mean, first of all, just to note the unusual timing of all of this for me, like I wrote this book all before COVID, right? I had shipped it off for copy edit 3 days before the pandemic broke, and quickly wrote an epilogue in the book all about COVID, so people can read that if they want to really delve into the answer to this question, and otherwise left the book stand. But it was awkward because the whole premise of my book was that we needed this historic reminder of how quickly we are capable of pivoting and moving, and yet here we all are experiencing just that in real time now. At one level, COVID's a real challenge to the climate emergency because just remember, a year ago, there was remarkable momentum building on the climate emergency. A year ago, we saw 1 million Canadians on the street on these student climate strikes. And that was the largest single day of mobilization in Canadian history. And these remarkable solidarity actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en. And all of this stuff has gotten pushed off the front burner in the wake of COVID. But here's where I take some solace, and where I think it actually sets us up well for confronting the climate emergency. I don't disagree with your caveats about inequality, but I do think it's worth appreciating that I think our appreciation of the role of government and public services is probably at a generational high. Our sense of social solidarity and cooperation across the country is at a real high. Our respect for science and scientists is at a new high. All of that sets us up well. But the really liberating part of this is what the government has demonstrated in terms of its spending, and in particular, the role of the Bank of Canada, which has been unlike anything we've seen since the war. The Bank of Canada has been buying up $5 billion in government securities a week since the start of the pandemic. And so what it's revealed, the cat's really out of the bag. Like, what they have shown in the level of spending is what was possible all along, if and when our governments actually see these things as the emergencies that they are.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, there's a similar argument made in the United States that there's clearly enough money for social programs, and that this sort of austerity, balance the budget above everything else is not.
And it's out the window now. All of that austerity. That's the thing about emergencies, is they allow governments to escape that austerity mindset. What's so frustrating is that, our federal government hasn't yet transitioned that same thinking to the climate emergency. So at the same time as they're spending $350 billion unexpectedly in confronting COVID, the spending that they're proposing to tackle the climate emergency pales in comparison. I mean, it's not a little less than what it should be. It's dramatically less by a massive order of magnitude. And so that's the moment we're in now, right? We need to push. Just to come back to that last question, I think there is fairly widespread agreement that the economic recovery out of this is going to be tough, and that it's going to have to be state-led, for the simple reason that the private sector has been too whacked. And the real debate will just be, what form will that public investment take? Will it be investment to restore the old, or will we seize upon this moment to catapult into the new? And that's the fight now before us, that to make it the latter.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I do fear that the expedient answer is say, there's too much. We just need to reboot the economy for now. We'll deal with climate later, but we can do more than one thing at a time. So someone asked in the chat the following question. It says, as climate change is a global challenge, why write a Canadian book? Mm-hmm. Do you believe policies should be local? And how do you see the link between the local and the global?
Well, it needs to be both. So I alluded to this in my opening comments, but we need to get our own house in order. So it's true that we are a small country, but our per capita emissions are the highest in the world. And that doesn't count our role as an extractor and exporter, right? And we are the world's 6th largest oil producer and 4th largest gas producer. So we got a lot of work to do to clean up our own house. And as I say, huge potential. Even though we're small, we can make a contribution, just like we did in the war. And that was widely recognized then. But we also need to do it knowing and trusting that millions of other people of goodwill around the world are having the same engagement with and issuing the same demands to their governments. And they are, right? That's, I think, as you become engaged in the climate movement, you become appreciative of the fact that similar things are happening in countries around the world. We do also need these global efforts. One of the things I'm involved in now is work in support of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So this was the idea is for a new global treaty because the Paris Agreement is silent on fossil fuels. It never mentions the words oil, gas, or coal, amazingly, the result of many years of successful lobbying by the fossil fuel industry. It strictly speaks to the demand side. And so this campaign is about saying we need a parallel or complementary treaty that tackles the supply side, the production side of fossil fuels. And in the same way that I was saying earlier, the benefit that comes with strong mandatory actions at the provincial or federal level, that allows us to escape the chump dynamic, right? That feeling like, oh, I don't want to take action if my neighbor isn't. The same is true internationally, right? We need a treaty that allows us to know, well, if we're not going to extract this stuff, others aren't going to just assume that space. And so that needs to happen too.
Okay, great. Actually, along those lines, you think about like the Trudeau government would love to be the leader of something, and they're always, ready to take that mantle. But and this seems to be the time and the opportunity for this kind of thing, but they have not really. And you think about also how, people expect the United States to lead. It hasn't happened for obvious reasons. So there is a sense of a gap of let's say, global leadership, but it could be very much a sort of Canadian story, as you
You
argue in the
can.
book.
Well, and I think particularly because, the Biden government's going to do a heck of a lot more. But a lot of it's going to be kind of buy American stuff. So we have to figure out how to tend to our own garden, as it were. Um, and let me say a word about C.D. Howe, this guy I talk about in the book. He was the minister for munitions and supply in the Mackenzie King government. No lefty, private sector guy, had made a lot of money in the private sector. But he was kind of seized with the task of meeting the military production needs. And, I marvel at the fact that this guy, again, kind of right-wing guy, created 28 crown corporations during the war. Every time the private sector couldn't quickly do what he needed done, he created another crown corporation. Um, and there's such a contrast with the Trudeau government, which in its time in office has created two crown corporations, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is basically a vehicle for privatizing infrastructure. And the second one, ironically and unfortunately, is the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation, the one that makes us all proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline from Alberta to my province. Whereas what I'm arguing in the book is, by the same logic that C.D. Howe created all these crown corporations, we need a new generation of crown corporations to mass produce and deploy the items that will allow us to electrify and decarbonize everything. At the moment, we're leaving it all, to price signals, and it won't happen at the speed and scale that we need. In the absence of creating these new crowns, the best we can do is encourage somebody else to do it instead of, and this is what I'd love to see from our governments, taking that on ourselves and driving that change.
Okay, great. Let me go to another question here from Sarah Wilson. She asks, what concepts within the field of climate emergency response do you consider the hardest to make accessible to a general audience? How have you accommodated that in your book, and what main takeaway do you hope all readers get from your book?
It's a hard question to answer. I mean, so first of all, I've tried to write a popularly accessible book, that even though, there are parts of the book that are kind of heavy on policy, um, that it's pretty understandable to start to envision. Well, maybe I would say this by answering your question. The hardest part is that we can't imagine what that other way of living looks like, because no one's painted the picture for us. And so I'm trying to do some of that in the book. We're also up against a reality which is just like the basic level of climate literacy is abysmal. As I mentioned in your local paper today, that only about half of the Canadian population understands that the main source of global warming is the combusting of fossil fuels. And which speaks to a lack of the media and government doing their job in terms of boosting that level of climate literacy. And in the absence of that, it means that people hold these very incongruous views, like they want to have climate action, but they still support the expansion of fossil fuel extraction. And you look at that and you think, well, how can they hold those same views simultaneously? Well, it's because we've done a really crappy job of explaining some basic stuff to people. And that's part of what we need to do.
Okay. I actually am curious. I don't know, the book hasn't been out for too long, but I'm wondering about the reaction already. Have you actually heard from some politicians about this, the need for big thinking and big leading and big planning?
Yeah, well, so overall, the reaction has been super positive. And I was actually expecting a little more hostility and pushback than I have experienced. So that's good. And I think for a lot of even environmental leaders and folks who work in this space, they find it liberating, because I think at some level everyone knows that what we've been doing isn't working and we need to try something else. And that invitation in the book for all of us to just ramp up our level of ambition is welcome. I have sent the book and shared the book and given the book to many politicians and political leaders. Again, I'm not to those who don't get it, right? My interest in the book are those political leaders who say they get it, but who aren't practicing a policy agenda that aligns with the science. And I've given the book to lots of them. I am starting to give briefings to certain political leaders and political teams about the core ideas in the book. So there is some willingness and appetite to at least hear those things. But whether or not they run with it, we will see. In the end, and this comes back to the previous question. What I'm trying to say in the book is that this is not a technical or policy problem. It's a political problem. And this is about all of us demanding true climate emergency mobilization from our political leaders, making it super clear to them that this is not only what we want, but what we demand. And those who are bold in the way that is required will be rewarded, and those who are not will be punished. That's the moment we find ourselves in.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add, it's also, you say it's a political mobilization. I would also add it's a cultural one, or let's even an artistic mobilization. Mm-hmm. You make room for that in the book. Mm-hmm. But and by the way, like, artists love it when you ask them, oh, just go big. Don't go small. So
good.
So I think this is going to be a good influence for climate mobilization art.
Well, and by the way, you were asking about the New Deal before, and so I do mention in the book that when we think about the New Deal in the States in the 30s, we tend to think about these huge infrastructure projects and dams and roads and national parks and this kind of thing. But the original New Deal also had a huge arts component. I mean, they funded thousands of artists across, theater, literature, painting, the works. And I think we need that again as a piece of this. So, I think there's a discussion to be had with every institution. What is your role in this climate emergency moment? The CBC needs to be having that conversation. The Canada Council needs to be having that conversation. All news media need to be having that conversation. What does it look like for us to treat this as the emergency that it is?
Yeah, I agree. A kind of arts mobilization, and that intersects with what you're talking about, which is a planned production system, as well as economic justice and social justice system as well. Those four categories, we include sort of art justice in some sense, or art accessibility as something that should be part of the central issue here. I wanted to ask about Harold Schuster, who not related to me, but ask a question here, and I'm not sure if that person's still here, but was wondering about, it says, COVID has shown that if we want, we can quickly retool our economy. So when he agrees with the comparison and to what we were able to do with in World War II, but World War II had a beginning and an end, and it was at that afterwards, it was presumed that life would return to normal once the war was over. Mm-hmm. So how do we approach that? How do we deal with what people feel would be a disruption in their lives? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, so the similarities have their breakdowns, right? Where it doesn't hold. But think about this. It's true that a war has an end period. The climate emergency also will have a kind of end period. We need to electrify everything. And that's really a 10 to 15 year endeavor. And then it will run its course. And the good news is the sacrifice that's being asked of people in the climate emergency is not akin to the sacrifice that was being asked of people in the Second World War, right? I mean, no one's asking anybody to offer up their lives. We're asking people to make much more minor sacrifices, and the result of it, what our communities look like at the other end, are a good life. It actually looks good. It looks nice. It's not a sacrifice at all. The other thing is that, in fact, the whole economic retooling in the war was twice. First, we had to ramp up all of these things for military production, and then we had to reconvert everything to peacetime. Whereas this moment only requires a transition once. So in some ways, I think it's easier. And similarly, when you think about the jobs challenge, like often when we talk about climate, people say, well, what about the jobs? And there's about 300,000 Canadians who are employed in the fossil fuel industry today. Think about that World War II comparison. And here again, I'm drawing on Peter Neary's work, on the development of the Veterans Charter. Over 1 million Canadians enlisted. More than that were directly involved in military production in World War II. Far, far more than are currently employed in the fossil fuel industry today. And what did we do for those folks? We offered income support programs. We offered housing support programs. We offered post-secondary programs that transformed the post-secondary sector in Canada for a generation, doubled the size nearly of the post-secondary sector in Canada, and changed the lives of thousands of people. If we could do all of those things then, by comparison, the task today is not nearly as great. We can certainly do it.
Yeah, I like that point. I mean, the big thinking point is not that, it's a temporary thing and that there'll be, a kind of normal that we'll get out of it. It's this sort of vision of a better normal, let's say, or the multiple gains we get out of this small sort of transition point that we have to go through.
Yes.
I think you make a great argument in the book that the Canadian people are ahead of the politicians on this issue. And there's a lot of evidence of that. And you have some surveys too that show that. I'm wondering, and one other, I think, feature of your book is that you bring together, 3, maybe 4 generations of activists from World War II to today. There was one activist, a younger person, I think, if I understood your book right, that you quote, named Kai Nada.
Kai Nagata.
Nagata, yeah. Who, and there's a citation you have here where he says, I'll just read it. It says, the impulse in a crisis is to narrowly define the we. And he goes on to point out that, in World War II, that in terms of xenophobia and issues around immigration, and that has returned today as a very powerful and problematic issue. So in your mind, with this big thinking, how do we avoid this narrowly defined we mentality that actually can be typical in sort of emergency times?
Yeah, it sure can. Well, and this is why, the book has a couple of chapters on the cautionary tales, as I mentioned off the top, the things that caused us shame. And the one that I think is the most apt is the response to refugees. So our response to refugees during the war was shameful. We slammed the door shut before, during, and after the war. And when you fast forward to the present, I believe that our response to climate migration will become one of the defining issues and tests of the next 50 years. And we're going to have to decide who we want to be. I cite Cindy Blackstock in the book, who's this incredible Indigenous child welfare advocate, who some years ago, I remember hearing her giving a speech in Vancouver in which she offered a definition of reconciliation that always stuck with me, a very simple definition, which was reconciliation means not having to say you're sorry twice. The answer to your question is we avoid it by being eyes wide open to the things that caused us shame and redouble our efforts not to make the same mistakes again.
Yeah, I think these are great answers. So actually, I have one last question then for you. And I'm really appreciative of joining us and walking us through the concrete steps and ideas that you present in this book together with us. My question is about just how you respond to this emergency mindset, and how you might talk people through it. I mean, it's it's very intense. You know, COVID has been very intense, and it's exhausting. And emergency mindsets. You know, at some point in your book, you say there's a risk of it being paralyzing, or as much as it might be sort of inspiring. And I'm wondering if you have had people, you know, talk to you about, you know, this emergency mindset as a heavy burden, or is it the right, you know, is it the right frame, you think?
Well, emergencies can be exhausting, and I think we all respond to them with ebbs and flows as we're all experiencing in the pandemic. Part of what makes the pandemic experience of the emergency hard is that it caught us off guard. The climate emergency should not catch us off guard. We know what's coming. And crises are coming, and extreme weather events are coming. And part of what I'm saying in the book is far better for us to see some agency in this moment and preemptively take action than having to respond in true emergency mode to increasing events that catch us off guard. You know, the line I use in the book is, we now mobilize to put fires out, but not to prevent them. It is far better to mobilize to prevent them. It is less disruptive. That is the way to sort of sustain this fight.
Okay, great. Well said. Okay. Well, Seth Klein, thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. And I want to thank the audience too for joining us.
Can I mention one other thought?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Just around, you know, that emergency mindset and what I'm asking of people. I mean, I am trying to enlist everybody in this moment. And because it is Remembrance Day, you know, the very few people who are listening right now were alive in World War II. But you know, if you're marking this day, and if you're listening to this event, you have some appreciation of the history, and you know, you read books about pivotal times like this. And I think there is probably a question in people's heads, and it's this: what would I have done if I had lived then and there? And my point in the book is to say that today, similarly, you know, with the future of our children in doubt and another civilizational threat on our doorstep, the answer to that question is really no great mystery. The answer to that question is whatever we are ready to do now.
I think that's very well said, nicely said. I think your book is very clear that, you know, this is a movement in which no one is left out, and that's a unique, you know, an important thing, that to have everyone together contributing is and to think that through at the level of policy and planning and inspiration, even cultural togetherness, artistic togetherness. I think it's quite it's a great big thinking way of approaching it. Okay, so thank you again, Seth. I also want to thank, for sure, Josh Lambier, the wonderful host and impresario of WordsFest. I can even mention that tomorrow, WordsFest continues, and there will be two wonderful speakers, Lona Crozier and Matter Anand, two excellent poets tomorrow. So thank you again, everyone, and thank you, Seth.
Thank you.